They blamed Lillian Hill before anyone asked why the Ferrari still would not run. She stood in the billionaire's private garage with a dust cloth in her hand. Victor Sloane, the famous restoration expert, pointed at her as if her quiet job title made her guilty. Then her son Caleb walked in from the rain, wearing boots from Spud Depot and a shirt still damp at the shoulders. They laughed before he finished speaking. But Caleb heard the engine die once, only once. And in that broken sound, he recognized the same hidden fault his father had warned about years before. Then he saw the red repair tag hanging from Victor's service cart, and the past came back like a door opening. Caleb looked at the billionaire, then at his mother, and said the words no one in that room was ready to hear. "You have been fixing the wrong problem." But before that garage learned the truth, we need to go back to the silence that taught Caleb how to listen. The first person they blamed was not the man who had charged millions and failed. It was the woman holding a dust cloth. Lillian Hill stood in Richard Vale's private garage with both hands open, as if innocence needed proof. Behind her, under bright white ceiling lights, sat a red Ferrari so polished it looked untouched by time. But it would not run. For 6 months, experts had surrounded that car. They replaced sensors, imported parts, rebuilt systems, flew in specialists, and sent invoices thick enough to make Richard Vale's own accountants nervous. $2,840,000. Still, when Richard turned the key that rainy Thursday morning, the Ferrari coughed once, shook, and died. Egan Richard stepped out slowly. Silver hair, navy suit, a face trained by money not to show panic. Who was near this car last night? No one answered. Victor Sloane, the restoration specialist, stood beside the Ferrari with a black folder under his arm. His company had been paid more than anyone, yet his eyes moved straight to Lillian. "She was cleaning in here after we left," Victor said, Lillian's chin lifted. "I swept the walkway, sir. I did not touch that car." Victor gave a thin smile. "Mrs. Hill, one careless movement around a vehicle this sensitive can undo weeks of work." The words were polite, the accusation was not. Richard turned toward her. "Did you touch it?" "No, sir." "Did your cart touch it?" "No, sir." "Was anyone with you?" Lillian hesitated. That tiny pause changed the room. "My son picked me up," she said. He waited by the side door. Victor's smile sharpened. Inside the garage, only when the rain got heavy. He stood near the entrance. Richard looked to Nolan Brooks, the estate security guard. "Bring him in." "Mr. Vale, please," Lillian said quickly. "My son did nothing." "Then he can say that himself." The side door opened. Caleb Hill stepped inside, wearing a charcoal work shirt, still damp from rain, dark mechanic pants, and worn black boots dusted from the bus depot where he worked nights. He was 23, quiet, lean, with eyes that noticed details before people noticed him. He looked first at his mother, then at the Ferrari, then at Victor Sloane. "Are you Lillian's?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir." Caleb Hill. "Were you in this garage last night?" "For about 4 minutes. I stood by that door." "You touched the car?" "No, sir." Victor stepped closer. "Do you even know what that car is?" Caleb looked at the red body. "A 962 Ferrari 250 GT Lusso, Colombo V12, 3 Weber carburetors, if it's still original." The room shifted. Only slightly, Caleb continued. "But from the sound it made just now, I don't think your problem is fuel." One mechanic laughed under his breath. "Now the maid's son diagnoses Ferraris by ear." Lillian turned. "Do not speak about him that way." Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Caleb's expression softened for 1 second. His mother had spent years lowering her eyes in rooms like this. Hearing her defend him made something in him stand taller. If you have ever watched someone be judged before they were understood, stay with Caleb's story and tell me in the comments who taught you not to look away. Victor closed his folder. Mr. Vale, this is becoming inappropriate. Caleb was no longer looking at him. He was staring at a red repair tag clipped to Victor's service cart. The tag was new, but the code written on it made Caleb's chest tighten. He had seen that pattern before, years earlier, in his father's old mechanic notebook. Jonah Hill had once tapped a page with an oil-stained finger and told him, "When they rename the same problem 3 times, Caleb, they are usually not fixing it. They are hiding it." Now that same warning seemed to be hanging in plain sight. Caleb pointed at the tag. Who authorized that replacement? Victor's jaw tightened. That is not your concern. It is if you charged him for it twice. The garage fell quiet. Audrey Vale, Richard's daughter, looked from Caleb to the tag. Nolan's eyes narrowed. Richard stared at Victor. Victor laughed, but it came too late. You have no idea what you are talking about. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Maybe. But that engine did not die like a fuel system failure. It died like the ignition signal was being interrupted after load transfer. And if that tag says what I think it says, you have been fixing around the real problem, not fixing it. For the first time, Victor looked afraid. Only for a second, then anger covered it. Get him out, Victor said. Richard lifted one hand. Stopping Nolan, rain slid down the garage windows. The Ferrari sat between them all, silent and gleaming, like it had been waiting for the one person nobody wanted to hear. Caleb looked at Richard Vale, then at his mother. And with every eye in that garage fixed on him, he said 7 words that would pull 6 months of lies into the open. You have been fixing the wrong problem. Caleb Hill had learned engines before he learned how to explain himself. When he was 9, other boys in their apartment building collected baseball cards and plastic action figures. Caleb collected broken things, a cracked radio from the laundry room, a fan with 1 dead speed, a toaster someone left by the dumpster. He liked the moment when silence became a clue. His father, Jonah Hill, used to say machines did not lie, people did. Jonah had worked most of his life around cars he could never afford. Old Jaguars, Bentleys with soft leather seats, German sedans owned by men who did not know where the hood release was. But the cars he loved most were Italian ones, because they sounded alive even when they were angry. On Sunday evenings, when Lillian cooked red beans in their small kitchen and rain tapped against the fire escape, Jonah would open his blue mechanic notebook and let Caleb sit beside him. Listen first, Jonah would say. A man in a hurry guesses. A mechanic listens. Caleb never forgot that. He also never forgot the night his father come home with grease on his sleeve and shame in his eyes. Jonah placed a red repair tag on the kitchen table. It was bent at one corner, stained with oil, and marked with a code Caleb was too young to understand. Lillian looked at it, then at her husband. What happened? Jonah sat down slowly. They billed a man for a part they never installed. Who did? Jonah rubbed his face. People with lawyers. That was all he said in front of Caleb. But later, when Caleb was supposed to be asleep, he heard his parents whispering through the thin wall. Jonah had questioned a luxury repair shop. He had asked why the same failure was being renamed on 3 different invoices. He had refused to sign a report he knew was false. A week later, he was gone from that job, not fired officially, just removed from the schedule. Ignored when he called, marked as difficult. After that, Jonah fixed delivery vans, church buses, and old family cars under a leaking tin roof behind a tire shop. He still smiled. He still taught Caleb. But something in him had been pushed down where no one could see it. Caleb grew up watching his father carry dignity like a heavy toolbox. Then Jonah died when Caleb was 17, not dramatically, not in a way that made the world stop. A heart attack after a double shift, a small funeral, a folded work shirt. a blue notebook left on Caleb's bed. Inside that notebook was everything Jonah could not afford to leave in money. Part numbers, sketches, warnings, engine sounds written in careful words, and tucked between 2 pages, the old red repair tag. Caleb kept it. By 23, Caleb was working nights at the East Fulton bus depot. He inspected brakes, changed belts, cleaned oil pans, and listened to tired engines under fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. He was good, better than good. But good did not pay much when your last name carried no recommendation, and your education ended at community college because rent came first. Every morning, he drove his mother to the Vale estate before sleeping a few hours. Lillian had cleaned that house for almost 7 years. She knew which hallway floor creaked near the library. She knew Richard Vale drank black coffee at 6:15 and left half of it untouched. She knew Audrey Vale always thanked her, but never warmly enough to become familiar. She knew the garage was the one room Richard treated like a chapel. Do not go near that Ferrari. Lillian had told Caleb the first time he picked her up there. Caleb had smiled. I know. I mean it. I know, Ma. But he noticed it anyway. The Ferrari sat beneath a gray cover most days, red paint flashing at the edges like something trying to breathe. Sometimes Caleb could smell fuel when Nolan opened the side door. Sometimes he saw Victor Sloane's technicians leaving with polished tool cases and clean hands. Clean hands always made Caleb suspicious. Real work left evidence. On the night before everything changed, rain came down hard enough to flood the gravel by the side entrance. Lillian was late finishing the garage because Richard had hosted guests and someone had tracked mud across the walkway. Caleb waited under the awning until water began blowing sideways. Nolan opened the door. Come in before you catch pneumonia. Caleb stepped just inside. He did not touch anything. He only stood near the wall, rain dripping from his sleeves, while Lillian finished wiping the baseboards. Then the Ferrari made a sound, not from the engine, from the service cart. A small plastic sleeve slipped from a folder and scattered papers across the floor. Caleb bent by instinct to help, then stopped when he saw the red tag clipped to the top page. A code was written there in black marker. For a moment, the garage disappeared. He was 9 again, sitting at the kitchen table, watching his father's finger tap an oil-stained tag. When they renamed the same problem 3 times, Caleb, they are usually not fixing it. They are hiding it. Caleb, Lillian whispered, leave it. He stepped back. But the code stayed in his mind all night. At 4:38 in the morning, after his shift at the bus depot, Caleb sat in his parked car outside their apartment with Jonah's notebook open on his lap. Rain ticked against the windshield. His mother slept upstairs. The city was still dark. He turned page after page until he found it. The old red tag. The handwriting was faded, but the pattern matched. Not exactly. Close enough to make his stomach tighten. Beside it, Jonah had written one sentence in blue ink. If this code appears again, check the ignition interrupter before they sell another ghost. Caleb stared at those words for a long time. A ghost. That was what rich men paid for when they trusted the wrong expert. A problem no one could see. A failure that kept returning. A repair that never ended. By sunrise, Caleb knew 2 things. First, his father had not been wrong. Second, if he spoke up, his mother might lose everything. So, when Richard Vale's garage door opened later that morning, and every powerful man in the room looked at Lillian like guilt had a uniform, Caleb understood the choice in front of him. Stay quiet and keep safe. Or speak and risk becoming his father's son in the worst and best way. Before Richard Vale became the kind of man who raised his voice in a garage, he had been the kind of man who listened when his wife laughed. That was what Audrey remembered most. Not the money, not the houses, not the charity dinners where everyone smiled too long. She remembered her mother, Marianne Vale. standing beside the red Ferrari in a tight summer dress, telling Richard he drove like a bank manager, afraid of joy. "Move over," Marianne had said. "Let the car breathe." That was in June of 2011 on a road outside Charleston, with salt wind coming through the windows, and Richard pretending not to smile. Audrey had been 19 then, sitting in the passenger seat of another car behind them, watching her mother's scarf whip in the wind. 6 months later, Marianne was diagnosed. 2 years after that, she was gone. The Ferrari became Richard's altar. He did not say it that way. Men like Richard rarely named their grief. They turned it into projects. They built climate-controlled garages. They hired specialists. They polished metal instead of touching old photographs. The car had not been driven in years when Richard finally decided to restore it. Victor Sloane arrived like a man born for expensive rooms. He wore black jackets with his company logo stitched small near the chest. He spoke softly, never rushed, and used words that made uncertainty sound like expertise. "Mr. Vale," he had said during the first inspection, "a car like this requires patience. These machines are emotional. They punish shortcuts." Richard liked that. It sounded respectful. It sounded rare. It sounded like Victor understood that this was not only a vehicle. The first invoice was large, but reasonable for a billionaire. The second was larger. The third came with photographs of parts laid out on white cloth, each one described like evidence from a sacred ceremony. By the 4th month, Audrey began asking questions. She found her father one evening in the garage, sitting in a folding chair 10 feet from the Ferrari, holding Marianne's old driving gloves. The leather had gone soft with age. "Dad," Audrey said, "you have paid him almost $2 million. Richard did not look up. "It is a rare car. It is also still not running. It will. You said that in July. It is October. That is my point." Richard closed his hand around the gloves. "You think I am being foolish?" Audrey wanted to say yes. Instead, she looked at the car and saw her mother's reflection in the red paint. Or maybe only the shape of a memory neither of them knew how to put down. "I think grief makes people trust the wrong promises," she said. Richard's face tightened. "Victor is the best." Best does not mean honest. That ended the conversation. For 3 days, Richard barely spoke to her. Audrey was used to that. Silence had become the family language after Marianne died. Richard used it as a wall. Audrey used it as protection. But on October 17, the night before Caleb walked into the garage, Audrey stayed late in the estate office, reviewing payment records. The room smelled like printer toner, old books, and cold coffee. Rain struck the windows in quick bursts. On the desks sat a stack of Sloane Heritage Zoders invoices, each stamped paid. Audrey was not a mechanic. She could not diagnose an engine by sound, but she understood numbers. And numbers, unlike people, did not flatter. She noticed the first duplicate at 10:42 p.m. Ignition control relay assembly. Then another invoice used a different phrase. Signal transfer module. Then another loan response regulator. 3 names. Similar says cost. Same labor hours. Same supplier code. Altered by 1 digit. Audrey leaned closer. Her pulse changed. She pulled the older invoices from the bottom drawer and lined them across the desk. Paper covered the wood from one edge to the other. There were small differences everywhere, the kind designed to make a tired person stop reading. But Audrey was not tired anymore. She was angry. At 11:16 p.m., she called Victor. He answered on the 4th ring. "Miss Vale," he said warmly, "is everything all right? I am looking at 3 invoices that appear to charge my father for the same system under different names." A pause. Not long, but long enough. "These are separate diagnostic categories," Victor said. "Then why do they share supplier references? Vintage documentation is complicated. I am not asking about vintage documentation. I am asking about billing." His voice cooled. "With respect, Your father understands the nature of this restoration. My father understands grief. That is not the same as understanding invoices. This time, Victor said nothing. Then he gave a quiet laugh. Miss Vale, I would be careful before making accusations you cannot support. Audrey hung up first. For several minutes, she sat alone in this office, listening to the rain. Then she took pictures of every invoice. She did not yet know about Jonah Hill's red repair tag. She did not know Caleb had seen the same code in his father's notebook. She did not know Lillian would be accused before breakfast. But she knew one thing. Victor Sloane had sounded less like an expert defending his work and more like a man guarding a locked door. The next morning, when Richard turned the key and the Ferrari died again, Audrey watched Victor blame Lillian Hill. And for the first time, she wondered if the most expensive thing in that garage was not the car. Maybe it was the lie everyone had been paying to protect. Lillian Hill knew the language of wealthy houses, not the words, the silences. She knew when a closed door meant privacy and when it meant shame. She knew when a guest smiled at her like a person's and when they looked through her like furniture. She knew which apology was real and which one was only fear of being overheard. For 7 years, she had worked inside Richard Vale's estate without breaking a glass, missing a morning, or speaking out of turn. She arrived before sunrise. She tied her hair back. She folded fresh towels in the east guest wing, polished the brass railing by the main stairs, emptied coffee cups from rooms where people discussed money as if it were weather. And every evening, she went home with swollen feet and the quiet pride of knowing Caleb had eaten, rent had been paid, and the lights were still on. That was why she was afraid of his gift, not because she doubted him. Because she knew the world punished poor people twice. First for not knowing enough. Then for knowing too much. When Caleb came upstairs after finding the matching code in Jonah's notebook, Lillian was sitting at the kitchen table with her work shoes beside her chair. The apartment smelled like rain, old wood, and the peppermint tea she drank when worry made her stomach tight. Caleb placed the blue notebook in front of her. She did not touch it. "Ma," he said, "Dad saw this before." Lillian closed her eyes. "Caleb, same pattern, same kind of invoice language, same trick. You do not know that. I know enough to ask questions. That is what scares me." He looked at her then, really looked. The woman who had defended him in every room she could afford to defend him in was now begging him not to step into a room where she could not protect him. Lillian touched the edge of Jonah's notebook with 2 fingers. "Your father asked questions too," she said. Caleb's voice dropped. "And he was right." "Yes," she said. "And being right did not save him from losing work." The sentence sat between them. Outside, a bus hissed at the corner. Somewhere downstairs, a neighbor's television mumbled through the floor. Caleb stared at the notebook like it had grown heavier. Lillian softened. "Baby, I am not telling you to be small. I am telling you that men like Victor Sloane do not fall alone. They grab for whoever is closest. That is why they blamed you. And if you push, they will blame you too." Caleb had no answer for that. The next morning, he drove her to the estate in silence. The rain had thinned into mist, turning the long driveway silver. The Vale house rose behind iron gates and old oaks, too large to feel lived in. Caleb parked near the service entrance, where delivery vans stopped and workers came and went without using the front steps. Lillian reached for the door handle, then paused. "Promise me you will not go looking for trouble." Caleb gave a sad little smile. "Trouble already knows our address." "Caleb," he nodded. "I promise I will not start anything." It was a careful promise. They both heard what it did not say. Inside the estate, Lillian tried to move through her routine, but the garage pulled at her mind. By 8:20, Richard had already asked Victor to run the Ferrari again. By 8:25, she heard the engine cough and die, Then came the voices, Richard's sharp tone, Victor's polished defense, mechanic laughing, her name. Lillian stood frozen in the hallway with a folded towel in her hand. When Nolan came to bring Caleb inside, she knew the morning had slipped beyond her control. Now, back in the garage, with Victor glaring and Richard watching, Caleb felt the old notebook inside his jacket like a second heartbeat. He had not planned to show it, not yet. He had only brought it because leaving it at home felt wrong. Victor stepped in front of the red repair tag, blocking Caleb's view. "Mr. Vale, I will not have an unqualified outsider interfering with a multi-million-dollar restoration," Caleb answered quietly. "Then explain the tag. There is nothing to explain." Audrey moved closer to the service cart. "Actually, I would like him to explain it." Victor turned. "Miss Vale, with respect, this is technical work, and billing is not." Richard frowned. "Audrey," she did not back down. "Dad, I found 3 invoices last night for what appears to be the same sum under different names." Victor's face tightened. "That is a misunderstanding." Caleb looked at Audrey. For the first time, someone in that house had said out loud what he was seeing. Lillian noticed the change in her son's posture. Fear rose in her throat. "Caleb," she whispered. He heard her, but he also heard his father. A man in a hurry guesses. A mechanic listens. Caleb stepped toward the Ferrari, not close enough to touch it, just close enough to see the service sleeve on the cart. There were printed reports inside. Most were fresh. One was older, folded behind the others. A corner stuck out, red stamp, failed diagnostic. Victor reached for the folder. Caleb saw him move too fast. So did Nolan. "Hold on," Nolan said. Everyone turned toward him. The security guard had barely spoken all morning. Now his calm voice carried weight. "If there is a question about what is in that folder," Nolan said, "maybe nobody should remove anything yet." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something?" Nolan's expression did not change. "I am asking you not to touch the papers." Audrey stepped to the cart and pulled the folder open before Victor could stop her. Inside was a diagnostic report dated 3 weeks earlier. At the bottom, in small print, one line was circled in red. "Ignition interruption detected under load." Caleb felt the room tilt toward the truth. Richard read the line once, then again. His face changed slowly. "Victor," he said, "why have I never seen this report?" Victor's mouth opened. No answer came out. And in that silence, Caleb knew the real fight had finally begun. Victor Sloane recovered quickly. Men like him usually did. For one brief second, the report in Audrey's hand had stripped the polish from his face. Then he pulled it back over himself like a clean jacket. "That document was preliminary," Victor said. Richard's voice stayed low. "It says ignition interruption. Yes, a possible reading. Later testing ruled it out." "Then where is the later report?" Victor looked toward his technicians. None of them moved. The garage seemed bigger now, colder. Every light above them reflected off the Ferrari's red paint, making the car look less like a prize and more like a witness waiting to be questioned. Audrey held the paper tighter. "This was dated 3 weeks ago. After this, you billed my father for fuel delivery components. Because the issue presented as fuel starvation," Victor said. Caleb shook his head once. Victor saw it. "Something funny?" he asked. "No," Caleb said. "Just familiar." Victor stepped closer to him. "You need to understand something. Reading old notes in your father's notebook does not make you a restoration expert." Lillian stiffened. Caleb's eyes lifted. "I did not say it did. Good. Because this is not a city bus. This is not something you patch together behind a depot with cheap tools and guesswork." The words were meant for Caleb, but they hit Lillian too. Her face tightened as if she had been slapped without a hand being raised. Nolan noticed. Audrey did too. Richard, caught between pride and doubt, said nothing. That silence hurt more than Victor's insult. Caleb looked at his mother. Her eyes were pleading with him to survive this room, not win it. So he breathed once. Then he reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out Jonah's blue notebook. Victor's expression changed again. Not enough for Richard to understand, enough for Caleb. "This belonged to my father," Caleb said. "He worked on European engines for 30 years. Victor laughed softly. "And now we are holding a memorial service?" Lillian stepped forward. Enough. Everyone turned to her. For years, she had cleaned around powerful people while making herself smaller than their furniture. But now she stood between Victor and her son, with a dust cloth still in her hand, and there was nothing small about her.
"You can question his credentials," she said. "You can question what he knows.
But you will not mock his father in front of me." Victor's mouth closed. Caleb swallowed hard. It was one thing to defend yourself. It was another to hear someone you loved spend the last of her safety on your name. Richard looked uncomfortable now. Not ashamed yet, just uncomfortable, which is often where shame begins when pride has not decided whether to move. Audrey placed the report on the service cart. "Caleb, what do you need to know?" Victor snapped. "He needs to leave." Caleb kept his eyes on Richard. "Give me 90 seconds. Richard frowned. "For what?" "To listen." One of the mechanics muttered, "This is ridiculous." Caleb ignored him. "Start the engine. No throttle. Let it catch. Let it fail." Then again with load on the electrical system. Headlights, ventilation, rear defrost if the conversion wiring supports it. Victor's face tightened. "Absolutely not." "Why?" Audrey asked. "Because I will not allow a stranger to run circus tricks on a historic vehicle." Caleb's voice remained even. "I am not touching it." Richard looked at Victor, then at Caleb. The garage waited. This was the kind of choice Richard Vale hated. Money had taught him that choices could usually be delegated. Hire the expert, sign the check, blame the worker, keep your hands clean. But the expert had hidden a report, and the worker's son had named the problem before seeing it. Richard walked back to the Ferrari. "Victor," he said, "start it." Victor stared at him. "Mr. Vale, start it." The command landed with the weight of ownership. Victor took the key from the console. His movements were controlled, but Caleb saw the strain in his fingers. The engine turned. For one beautiful second, the Ferrari came alive. A deep metallic growl filled the garage, rich and uneven, like an animal waking in pain. Caleb closed his eyes, not to appear dramatic, to remove everything that did not matter. The engine coughed. The rhythm dipped, then it died. Silence rushed back. Caleb opened his eyes. Again, with headlights. Victor did not move. Richard's voice hardened. "Do it." The second start was worse. The headlights came on. The engine caught, stumbled faster, then cut out as if someone had pinched a wire inside its chest. Caleb pointed toward the left rear quarter panel. "There." Victor's jaw flexed. "There what?" "The interruption is not at the fuel rail. It is not the carburetors. It is not vapor lock. The signal drops when the auxiliary circuit draws load. Something is cross-feeding into the ignition line." Audrey looked at the car, then at Caleb. "Can that happen by accident?" "It can," Caleb said, "but not after this many repairs." Richard's eyes darkened. Victor raised his voice. "This is speculation." "No," Caleb said. "Speculation is charging a man for the same ghost under 3 names." The room tightened. Victor took one step forward. Nolan took one step too, not threatening, just present. From near the tool cabinet, Grace Elam, Victor's junior service advisor, stood pale and silent. She had not spoken all morning. Caleb had noticed her earlier because she kept looking at the folder like it could burn her. Now her lips parted. Victor turned toward her before she said anything. "Grace," one word, a warning. Grace looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Audrey saw it. "Grace, do you know something?" The young woman's eyes filled, but she held herself together. There were more reports. Victor's face went flat.
"Be careful."
Grace looked at Richard. 2 more. Both showed ignition interruption under electrical load. I scanned them into the internal system before they were removed from the client file. The garage became so quiet, Caleb could hear rain ticking against the glass. Richard stared at Victor. Removed by whom? Grace's voice trembled. I was told not to ask. Victor shook his head. She is confused. Grace reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. I am not confused, she whispered. Caleb looked at the drive, then at the Ferrari, then at the red tag clipped to the cart. 90 seconds had become something else now. Not a diagnosis, a doorway. And behind it was the truth. Victor had spent millions of Richard Vale's money trying to keep locked. The USB drive in Grace Elam's hand looked too small to frighten anyone. But Victor Sloane stared at it like it was a loaded weapon. Richard Vale held out his palm. Give it to Audrey. Grace hesitated. Victor's voice dropped. Grace, think carefully. She looked at him, and for the first time, her fear had something harder inside it. I have been thinking carefully for 6 months, she said. Audrey took the drive and crossed to the office computer near the back wall. The screen woke with a cold blue glow. Rain kept tapping the glass. Nobody spoke while the files opened. 3 reports appeared. Same vehicle, same failure pattern, same warning. Ignition interruption detected under auxiliary electrical load. Richard read the words without blinking. Victor. Victor lifted both hands. This proves nothing. Diagnostic data can be misread. Classic vehicles produce false signals all the time. Caleb stepped closer to the Ferrari, still careful not to touch it. Then let me prove it without touching anything important. Victor turned sharply.
You have already done enough.
No, Caleb said. You have. The words were calm, but they struck the room. Richard looked at Caleb. What do you need? A basic continuity tester, a small inspection mirror, and permission to open the left rear access panel. Victor almost laughed. You want to open bodywork on a 250 GT Lusso with a cheap tester? Caleb looked at him. No, I want to find the place where your expensive repairs stopped looking. Nolan stepped toward the tool cabinet. I have an inspection mirror in my security cart. Everyone looked at him. He shrugged, old habit. Within a minute, the mirror was in Caleb's hand. Audrey found a tester from the estate maintenance drawer. Richard stood close enough now to watch, but not close enough to interfere. Lillian stayed near the side door, one hand pressed against her chest. She wanted to stop her son. She wanted to save him, but she also knew something had changed. This was no longer just about a job. This was about every quiet insult she had swallowed because rent was due. Caleb knelt beside the Ferrari. His movements were slow, respectful. Not the way Victor's technicians moved when they wanted to impress a client. Caleb moved like the car was a living memory, and careless hands could bruise it. He opened the small access panel near the left rear quarter. The smell came first, old insulation, warm metal. A faint, burnt sweetness. Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. Then he used the mirror. There, he said. Richard leaned forward. What? Caleb angled the mirror so Audrey could see. That wire bundle should not be pinched against that bracket. Victor stepped in. That is factory routing. No, Caleb said. Factory routing does not leave fresh tool marks on a 60-year-old bracket. Audrey crouched slightly, careful of her cream blouse. I see them. Caleb pointed with the tester not touching yet. When the headlights come on, load increases through this auxiliary line. The damaged insulation lets current bleed into the ignition circuit. Not enough to burn the car, enough to interrupt spark and kill the engine. Richard's face drained slowly. So all the fuel work was never the main problem, Caleb said. Victor's voice rose. That is a theory. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out Jonah's blue notebook. This time, he opened it not with anger, with reverence. He turned to a page near the back, where the paper had yellowed and the ink had faded, but not disappeared. Tucked beside it was the old red repair tag. The garage seemed to shrink around that little piece of paper. Caleb placed it on the service cart beside Victor's fresh red tag, old tag, new tag, same pattern, same kind of lie. "My father wrote about this," Caleb said. "Years ago." Richard stared at the tags. "Your father worked on my car?" "No," Caleb said. "But he worked near the same kind of fraud. Same billing pattern, same renamed failure, same ignored ignition warning." Victor's face hardened. "This is absurd." Caleb read from the notebook. "If the fault disappears when isolated and returns under auxiliary load, inspect rear harness before replacing fuel components. Do not let them sell another ghost." No one moved. For a moment, Caleb was not in Richard Vale's garage. He was back in the small kitchen, smelling burnt coffee and machine oil, watching his father write warnings no one powerful had wanted to hear. Lillian covered her mouth. She had never seen that page. Not like this. Richard's voice was quieter now. "Who was your father?" "Jonah Hill." Victor looked away too fast. Audrey saw it. Nolan saw it. Caleb saw it most clearly of all. "You knew him," Caleb said. Victor's jaw worked once. "I knew many mechanics. My father lost work after he refused to sign a false report." Victor gave a cold smile. "Many men blame others for their failures." Lillian stepped forward. "Do not." But Caleb raised one hand gently, stopping her. His eyes stayed on Victor. "No," he said. "Let him talk. Men like him always tell the truth by accident when they think they are insulting you." Audrey turned back to the computer. "Grace, were there archived notes attached to these reports?" Grace nodded. "There should be a technician comment file." Audrey clicked. A document opened. The technician comment was short. Possible rear harness damage. Recommend inspection before additional part replacement. Below it was a name. Jonah Hill. Caleb stopped breathing. Lillian whispered, "Jonah?" Richard looked confused. "How is that possible?" Grace's voice shook. "Some old reports were imported into our system when Sloane Heritage bought smaller shop records years ago. I did not know the name mattered." Caleb stared at the screen. His father had been there all along. Not in the room, not in the grave, in the record, in the warning. In the truth, nobody had bothered to read because there was more money in ignoring it. Victor moved suddenly toward the computer. Nolan blocked him, not with force, with presence. "Step back," Nolan said. Victor's eyes flashed. "Move. No." That single word changed the temperature in the room. Richard Vale, who had been staring at the screen like his money had betrayed him, now turned toward Victor with something colder than anger. "You told me every possible historical record had been reviewed." Victor said nothing. Caleb picked up the old red repair tag. His hand trembled now, not from fear, from the weight of a dead man being heard too late. Then Caleb looked back at the open panel of the Ferrari. "There is one way to end this," he said. Richard's voice was rough. "How? Let me isolate the damaged wire and start it again." Victor snapped, "If he touches that car, I will not be responsible." Caleb looked at him. You stopped responsible the moment you found the truth and chose another invoice." No one defended Victor. "Not now," Richard stepped aside. "Do it," he said. Caleb knelt again, the old red tag resting beside him like a witness. And for the first time since he entered that garage, nobody called him the Maid's son. They waited for him like he was the only mechanic in the room. Caleb did not rush. That was what Richard noticed first. Every expert he had paid moved around the Ferrari, like performance was part of the invoice. Fast hands, confident words. Expensive tools placed where clients could see them. Caleb moved differently. He knelt beside the open panel with the old red repair tag near his knee, and worked like a man listening to someone whisper. He used the inspection mirror first, then the tester, then one careful hand to separate the damaged wire from the bracket. The garage held its breath. Lillian stood near the side door. Tears caught in her eyes but not falling. Audrey watched the computer screen, one hand resting near the invoice folder. Grace kept both arms wrapped around herself. Nolan stayed between Victor and the office desk. Victor was the only one who could not keep still. "This proves nothing," he said again. But this time, nobody answered him. Caleb wrapped the exposed section temporarily, isolated the auxiliary line, and checked the tester once more. Then he stood. "Try it now," he said. Richard looked at the Ferrari. For a moment, he was not a billionaire. He was an old man, afraid of being disappointed by a memory. He sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine caught. It stumbled once, then held. A deep, living sound filled the garage. Not perfect, not fully restored, but alive. Lillian covered her mouth. Audrey closed her eyes. Grace began to cry silently. Richard did not move. His hands stayed on the wheel as the red Ferrari breathed for the first times. In months, Caleb listened for 5 seconds, then nodded. "Shut it off," Richard obeyed. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Before, silence had protected the powerful. Now it accused them. Richard stepped out slowly. His face had gone pale. "How much of what I paid for was unnecessary?" he asked. Victor adjusted his jacket. "Mr. Vale, emotions are high. We should discuss this privately." "No," Audrey said. "We should not." She lifted the invoice folder. "You charged for repeated replacements after your own reports identified the actual fault." Grace wiped her face. "And staff were told to remove those reports from the client file." Victor turned on her. "You were an assistant. You do not understand what you saw." Nolan spoke from near the desk. "She is not the only one who saw things." Victor froze. Nolan reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small storage card. Richard frowned. "What is that?" "Security backup," Nolan said. "Garage feed from the past 6 months." Victor's expression hardened.
You had no right.
Nolan looked at him calmly. "My job is to protect this estate. That includes protecting it from people who walk in wearing expensive jackets." Audrey inserted the card into the computer. The first clip showed Victor's technicians removing a report from the service folder after Richard left the garage. The second showed a part box photographed beside the Ferrari, then carried back out unopened. The third showed Victor himself standing near computer, pointing at a diagnostic result before one of his employees deleted it from the client copy. Richard watched without speaking. With every clip, the room stripped away another layer of Victor Sloane's authority. Finally, Audrey opened an older archived file connected to Jonah Hill's name. There was a scanned complaint from years before. Jonah had warned that a luxury repair network was renaming electrical faults to justify repeated part replacements. He had included tag codes, invoice patterns, and technician notes. At the bottom was a response from a regional supervisor. "Complaint dismissed due to lack of supporting authority." Caleb stared at those words. Lack of supporting authority, not lack of truth, just lack of power. Richard turned to Victor. "Did your company acquire these records?" Victor's voice was quiet now. "Old files come with acquisitions." "Did you know Jonah Hill filed this complaint?" Victor did not answer. Caleb did not need him to. Richard stepped closer, his grief finally turning into something useful. "You let me pay millions to bury a problem that man had already named." Victor's face tightened. "Your car required extensive restoration. My car required honesty." The words landed clean. For the first time that morning, Richard looked at Lillian, not around her, not through her, at her. Then he looked at Caleb. "I owe your mother an apology," he says. Lillian's hands trembled. Richard's voice lowered. "Mrs. Hill, I accused you because it was easier than questioning the man I had paid to know better. That was wrong." Lillian held his gaze. Years of swallowed words seemed to rise behind her eyes. "Yes," she said, "it was." The room went still. Richard nodded once, accepting it. Then Caleb placed the old red repair tag beside the new one and opened Jonah's notebook to the marked page. "My father did not want revenge," Caleb said. "He wanted people to stop selling ghosts to grieving men and blaming workers when the ghosts came back." Audrey looked at him with tears in her eyes. Richard stared at the notebook. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Caleb looked at his mother first, then at the Ferrari, then at his father's handwriting. "I want his name restored," Caleb said. "And I want every person who was blamed for this car to receive a written apology. My mother first." Victor gave a bitter laugh. "You think a notebook makes you important?" Caleb turned to him. "No," he said. "The truth does." That was when Richard Vale finally made his choice. He picked up his phone, called his legal counsel, and put it on speaker. "Cancel all payments to Sloane Heritage Motors," he said. "Preserve every invoice, every report, and every recording, and prepare a public correction regarding Jonah Hill." Victor's face emptied. For years he had survived because rooms believed the most polished man first. But now the garage had heard the car run, and it had heard Caleb Hills speak. Victor Sloane left the garage without slamming a door. That was the strangest part. A man who had spoken all morning as if every surface belonged to him, now walked out quietly, followed by two technicians who would not meet Ennyson's eyes. His shoes made small sounds against the polished floor. Then the side door closed, and his reflection disappeared from the Ferrari's red paint. For a moment, nobody moved. The car sat silent again, but it no longer felt broken. It felt relieved. Richard Vale stood beside it with his phone still in his hand. The lawyer's voice had gone quiet on the other end. Audrey was gathering the invoices. Grace sat down near the service desk as if her knees had finally given out. Nolan watched the garage door, making sure the wrong man did not return with another performance. And Caleb stayed beside the open panel, holding his father's red repair tag. Lillian walked to him slowly. "Baby," she whispered. Caleb turned. For most of his life, he had tried not to cry in front of his mother. Sons do that sometimes. They mistake silence for strength because they have watched their mothers carry too much already. But when Lillian touched his face, Caleb's eyes filled. "I was scared," she said. "I know. I am still scared. I know." Then she looked at the Ferrari, at Richard, at the folder of invoices, at the old notebook in her son's hand. "But your father would have been proud." Caleb closed his eyes. Those words did what applause could not. Richard approached them carefully. For once, he did not walk like a man entering his own room. He walked like a man asking permission. "Caleb," he said, "I would like to hire you to finish the repair." The garage went quiet again. Caleb looked at him. "No." Richard blinked. "No? No, sir." Audrey's expression softened as if she understood before her father did. Caleb placed Jonah's notebook on the service cart. "I will help document what was done wrong. I will help your legal team understand the mechanical part. And I will show your new mechanic where the fault is. But I will not become another man you call only after rich people fail." Richard took that in. It was not disrespect. It was a boundary. And men like Richard were not used to workers having those. Caleb continued. "My father spent years being treated like a warning instead of a witness. I will not let his name be used, only because it saves your car now." Richard lowered his eyes. For a long time he said nothing. Then he nodded. "That is fair." Lillian looked at Caleb with a kind of wonder. Not because he had fixed a Ferrari. She had always known his hands were gifted. But because he had stood in a room built to shrink him and refused to become small. 2 weeks later, Richard Vale issued a public correction. It did not make national news. It did not need to. But in the places where it mattered, people read it. A respected restoration company had concealed diagnostic findings. Multiple workers had been wrongly blamed. Jonah Hill's archived complaint had been accurate. His name was restored. Caleb printed the correction and placed it inside the blue notebook, behind the old red repair tag. Lillian watched him do it at their kitchen table, the same table where Jonah had once left that tag with shame in his eyes. Only now, the tag did not feel like shame. It felt like proof. Grace Elam left Sloane Heritage Motors and testifies in the civil case. Audrey helped her find legal protection and later offered her a position managing compliance for the Vale family office. Nolan Brooks received a formal commendation, though he only shrugged when Lillian congratulated him. "Just kept the cameras honest," he said. Richard sold 3 cars from his collection that winter, not the Ferrari. He kept that one, but he stopped treating it like a shrine. On the first clear Sunday in December, he asked Audrey to ride with him. They drove slowly along the coast road, where Marianne once laughed at him for driving like a bank manager afraid of joy. This time, Richard let the engine breathe, and when he returned, he sent Lillian a handwritten apology. Not an email, not a typed note from an assistant. A letter, Mrs. Hill. "I mistook your quiet for powerlessness. I mistook your position in my home for permission to doubt your word. I am sorry. Your son did not only repair what was broken in my garage, he revealed what was broken in my judgment." Lillian read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the same drawer where she kept rent receipts, Caleb's school certificates, and Jonah's last birthday card. Some papers are not valuable because of what they cost. They are valuable because they tell the truth after years of silence. Caleb did not become famous overnight. That would have made the story too easy. He kept working at the bus depot for a while. He still woke before sunrise, still checked on his mother, still wore the same black boots, with dust in the seams, but something changed. People started calling, not because he had a fancy certificate, because word travels when a quiet man tells the truth and a dead engine starts. 6 months later, Caleb opened a small diagnostic shop on the east side of Fulton. No marble floors, no velvet ropes, no receptionist trained to decide who belonged. Above the front desk, he framed 3 things: his father's red repair tag, the public correction, and a handwritten sign, "Listen first." On opening day, Lillian stood by the door wearing a blue dress Caleb had bought her with his first deposit. She greeted every customer like they were entering something sacred. Near closing time, Richard Vale arrived, not in the Ferrari, in a plain black sedan. He stepped inside, looked around, and said, "Your father would like this place." Caleb looked at the framed tag, then at his mother, then back at Richard. "Yes," he said, "I think he would." The Ferrari was eventually repaired properly by an independent specialist Caleb recommended. When it returned to the road, Richard invited Caleb to hear it run one final time. Caleb stood outside the garage as the engine turned over. This time, there was no cough, no stumble, no ghost, just a clean, steady sound rising through the open air. Lillian reached for Caleb's hand. He let her hold it. For years, people had called her just the maid. For years, people had called him just her son. But truth has a way of changing the meaning of small words. Because that morning in Richard Vale's garage, the maid was the woman who had raised the only person brave enough to listen. And the maid's son was the man who heard what millions of dollars could not. If this story reminded you of someone whose gift was ignored because of where they came from, honor them in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that truth may arrive quietly, but it does not stay silent forever.